Hello, and welcome to The Lady of the Rings. Today, we are going to be diving into Tolkien's Foreword to the second edition of the trilogy. Now, I wanted to talk about this because I think it gives us great context into Tolkien's intention with telling these stories and gives us a really good framework for continuing through our reread of the trilogy to understanding kind of how these stories unfold, give us a little insight into Tolkien's creative process and how his own experiences impacted his work. So let's get right into it. The beginning of the foreword, the very first sentence says, "This tale grew in telling until it became a history of the great War of the Ring and included many glimpses of the yet more ancient history that preceded it." So in the first part of the foreword, Tolkien just talks a little bit about his timeline for writing both The Hobbit as well as the Lord of the Rings trilogy itself. The Hobbit was published first as a children's book, and then the trilogy was published some years after that. It took him almost 20 years to write the trilogy, but he says in his foreword that he started working on the trilogy merely for himself, because after writing The Hobbit, or while he was writing The Hobbit, these histories just started revealing themselves to him, and this tale grew until it became the story of the War of the Ring and the trilogy that we have today. He really talks about the story as having a life of its own. The trilogy grew from this seed that was planted in his head when he wrote The Hobbit, and he just basically started writing out histories for all of these different kind of creatures that he came up with and for this universe that he had invented, Middle Earth. And like I said, he really talks about it like it has a life of its own, and the story is merely being communicated to us through him as a vessel, as a almost historian of Middle Earth. The story was drawn irresistibly towards the older world and became an account, as it were, of its end and passing away before its beginning and middle had been told. So I just think that's a really great line because, again, the story has an agency to Tolkien. He doesn't say, I was drawn irresistibly to the older worlds, but rather that the story itself was drawn irresistibly toward the older world and became an account, as it were, of its end and passing away. So he talks a little bit about in the foreword on the first couple of pages, just mostly like the timeline for writing The Hobbit and for writing the trilogy. And like I said before, he didn't think anyone would want to read the trilogy, and he didn't think that this tale that was unfolding to him and revealing itself to him was going to be as popular as it has been. And I think that's part of what makes it so magical and so great, is that he was really doing it just for himself and doing it just for the sake of telling a story. Now, after he talks a little bit about kind of the reception of the trilogy, the reception of the Lord of the Rings, he writes that, as for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. So he's saying that for him and his own intentions, this story has no message at all, which is pretty crazy considering the amount of messages that you can draw from these stories. He writes that it is neither allegorical nor topical. As the story grew, it put down roots into the past and threw out unexpected branches. Again, talking about the story as if it has a life of its own, and actually comparing it to a tree, which I'm just realizing now. He writes, but its main theme was settled from the outset by the inevitable choice of the ring as the link between it and the Hobbit. The crucial chapter, The Shadow of the Past, which is chapter 2 of the trilogy, is one of the oldest parts of the tale. It was written long before the foreshadow of 1939 had yet become a threat of inevitable disaster, and from that point, the story would have developed along essentially the same lines if that disaster had been averted. So what he's talking about here actually is the events of World War II. And he's saying that in chapter 2 of the Fellowship, when he describes the history of the ring itself and how it actually came to Gollum and then Bilbo, he wrote that prior to the events of World War II, and pretty much while he was publishing and writing The Hobbit. So I think that that's really interesting to know that chapter 2 of the Fellowship is actually the oldest part of the trilogy. It's the part that was written first. And you can kind of see how in chapter 2, once he kind of sets these roots down and lays out this story, how it unfolds throughout the rest of the trilogy. So in regards to comparing the story of the Lord of the Rings to the events of World War II, which when the books became popular, most readers were kind of viewing it as an allegory for World War II, or a lot of people were writing into him and saying that they thought that this was an allegory for the rise of fascism. And Tolkien rejects that vehemently in his foreword. He writes that if it was supposed to be an allegory for World War II, that the narrative actually would look entirely different. For example, he writes that in that conflict, both sides would have held hobbits in hatred and contempt. They would not long have survived even as slaves. And I think that also shows us Tolkien's contempt for war in general. He believes that in our own world, and all the evils that he's seen and he's experienced through war in his own life, these hobbit creatures would not have survived, would not have been protected the same way that they were in Middle Earth, and they were allowed all of this comfort and this peace and tranquility for so long. So going back to Tolkien's discussion about allegory, he really rejects that the story of the Lord of the Rings is an allegory for anything, and he rejects it in favor of history. So what he's saying here is that these books and these stories are really meant to be a history told of Middle Earth, and it's not supposed to be an allegory for anything that happens in our world. He writes in regards to history that true or fiend with its varied applicability and experience of the readers. I think many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purposed domination of the author. And I think that's a really great way to frame the story, because what Tolkien is saying here is that this story, yes, it can be applicable to things that are going on in the world, or even struggles that are going on in somebody's personal life. And that's what makes it so personal when you're reading the stories, and so emotional and so special, because it can be applicable to all different types of things, to people from all walks of life. And he's also saying that history's relevance to various readers may change depending on the time and place of that reader. So what makes these works so timeless is that when you're reading the books in 2025, you may compare a lot of Tolkien's kind of love of nature, and then the enemy's destruction of nature, to our own world and how corporations are destroying our environment. So the story is applicable to our world in 2025 because we can find parts of it that make us feel things about what's going on around us. However, he stands his ground on the fact that this is not an allegory that he had in mind. There's no agenda here from him as the author to compare the story to some events that are going on. So some thoughts that I had about this part of the foreword, I immediately thought about great epics like the Tales of Arthur or the Iliad or the Odyssey, and these timeless stories that we still read and talk about today, which have these kernels of truth and of applicability to their own time period and the context of the place and the time that they were written in. But at the same time, these are fantastical tales, and although we study them to understand more about what the world was like at that time, they still have themes and emotions and characters that are applicable to our own lives. And the purpose of those tales, of those epic tales, was not an allegory, was not to necessarily act as a moral pathway, but at the end of the day was meant to entertain an audience and intrigue listeners. And they were so popular because they were entertaining and because they could be applied to a variety of different people in a variety of different places across different time periods. So comparing The Lord of the Rings to these kind of great epics throughout history, I think makes sense because of how timeless the story feels and how it really has continued to stand the test of time and be so popular for decades now. So the next section of the foreword and the final section is Tolkien talking a little bit about his own life influences on the story of The Lord of the Rings. And he does not deny that his own experience has influenced his work. So his own experiences fighting in World War I, living through World War II, growing up in Britain and kind of seeing it industrialized throughout his life, seeing post-war Britain, he does not deny that these events that he lived through influenced his own work. And so a lot of the parallels that people may draw between the stories and the events that were happening during Tolkien's life are not necessarily incorrect, but I think it's important to remember that Tolkien's intention was not to write these stories to symbolize something like religion or politics or global events. He writes that an author, of course, cannot remain wholly unaffected by his experience, but the ways in which a story germ uses the soil of experience are extremely complex, and attempts to define the process are at best guesses from evidence that is inadequate or ambiguous. So what he's really saying here, again, is that the story has a life of its own, and that the way that a story unfolds to him is complex, and trying to understand it, trying to define it, and kind of put it in a box and just say, oh, it's all about the rise of fascism, and it's all about anti-fascism, or it's all about environmentalism. It's a collection of stories that are made up about this universe of Middle Earth. And that's really what he's trying to say it is at the end of the day, is that it's a story. And using themes from this story, using parts of this story to apply it to current events, to apply it to historical events, it's not incorrect, but it wasn't his intention, and it's not like this story, like I said, fits into one box or one category and what it should symbolize. So he talks a little bit about his own life and how that did affect and impact his stories, he thinks, in some ways. And again, he's not denying that his life impacted his stories and that events and things that were going on impacted his stories. For example, he writes that his world was threatened by machinery, global war caused by power grabs, and all he saw was nature being sacrificed at the hands of money, power, and greed. And that is definitely a theme that we can resonate with in 2025. He writes that it's not an allegory by any means, but he also uses these themes of human advancement to invite us to reflect on our own modern world and see hope through it all. His experiences inspired him to tell a story for the sake of telling a story as a historian of Middle Earth. So that concludes my overview of the foreword to the second edition of Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you're interested in more bonus content, I'm going to be publishing an episode where I cover the prologue in depth, and his section about concerning hobbits. So definitely stay tuned for more episodes. Follow me on TikTok and Instagram at Lady of the Pod. I would love to hear your feedback. Please feel free to DM me on either of those accounts, and I will definitely respond. I'm open to your thoughts because I'm still new to this, and I want to know what you guys think so far. Until next time, this is Lady of the Rings. I'm your host, Sophia, and welcome to our fellowship.